Right, hi Charlotte.
Hello.
Thanks very much for agreeing to talk to us. I really would like to hear about your background, the research that you've been involved in, and a little bit about where you might be going in the future. So tell us a bit about yourself, your background leading into the PhD, because you've got a long-standing interest in bodybuilding, haven't you?
Yeah, I suppose I first became interested in bodybuilding when I sort of happened upon training in a bodybuilding gym like many years ago now. And that, I suppose, piqued my interest in the sport. It was where I kind of decided, yes, that was the physique goals that were for me, and sort of became, involved in that community, and actually ended up sort of moving into the fitness industry as a result of that. And doing my master's in exercise and nutrition science because that became an area of interest. And personally, I wanted to pursue that goal. And I guess it was further down the line that I, started to recognize that there were, pharmaceuticals involved with that sport, which I was probably quite naive to when I first sort of set foot in that gym initially. And I suppose coming to the PhD, I'd started to get quite fascinated because I'd sort of battled with that decision, battled with like how to achieve this body that I now had set in my mind. And I'd seen other people kind of breeze through the process, and I suppose I was interested in what other people's experiences were, how they made the decision to become an assisted athlete, to take steroids and fat burners or whatever else, was necessary to achieve that stage physique. So I guess, and obviously my background in the fitness industry, being a fitness instructor and recognizing what's valued in the fitness community and in the wider bodybuilding community, and essentially it's largely your body aesthetic, and that also fueled my sort of desire to achieve that.
But I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because I suppose for a lot of the people I talk to about anabolic steroids, it's about for starters, it's usually focused on males, and quite a lot of it is about people conforming to a media-driven, stylized body image. But it's very different for women in that whole area where it's not conforming to a media stereotype in some way, is it?
No, I mean, especially when I first went to that gym, I mean, nowadays the fitness industry has moved towards a bit more of a sort of muscular, lean ideal, but obviously nowhere near in the sort of heavier bodybuilding categories. When I first came to bodybuilding, it was very niche. And of course, there is a fine line that women have to tread between that slightly more mainstream fitness commercial look and then choosing to go into the heavier physique and maybe bodybuilding classes. So yeah, it's and even within the community there can be judgment there, but obviously outside of that, lifting weights is traditionally seen as a male pursuit, and you should be off in the cardio area. So yeah, I think it is a unpopular sort of choice for women.
So moving on, and your PhD, and I mean it was done at Liverpool John Moores University, and but it was very much you took that and made it your own from the ground up, and I suppose we didn't know what to expect, but we got to a very challenging PhD. But tell us about it.
Well, I suppose in the first instance, kind of realised that understanding the process of maybe being somebody who just goes to the gym recreationally, or maybe someone who's never set foot in the gym, to deciding to become a bodybuilder, entering that community, deciding to do a competition, and understanding at what point you may also decide to use performance enhancers. You're not going to get that from a questionnaire. So it's really about understanding that whole process, and I suppose that's where the sort of the ethnographic sort of methodology really came into its own in order to do that. And obviously, you know, my previous background and ability to be competent in those types of environments was, you know, efficacious for that, really. So, you know, I was sort of participant observer as well as doing sort of one-to-one interviews and a small sort of photo elicitation task. So, yeah, I think that really allowed sort of that journey to come out, really, and a greater understanding of that you couldn't really elicit in any other way.
Yeah, and there was no way that, I suppose, you could have got that close contact without being part of that culture.
No, I think, yeah, you have to be integrated into that sort of culture to understand what it's like to be in that environment, to understand, like, you know, why you might make certain choices and what it feels like to be part of that community, to really understand, like, okay, you know, why people might make those decisions. I think, yeah, and a total outsider just looking in with other tools, you know, couldn't capture those feelings, that experience.
And even so, did you come across any resistance to, you know, a researcher being in there and, you know, not passing judgment, but certainly documenting and passing on what goes on? Was there any challenges around that?
I suppose, you know, the bodybuilding community can be sort of like wary of, you know, interest from relative outsiders, because they often get quite a lot of bad press. I mean, I didn't find it too much of a challenge being integrated into communities because I already had some contact in the sort of bodybuilding world. Obviously, having said that, you know, there were plenty of people I approached for interview who didn't want to be interviewed about the sort of topic. And obviously I was asking about their bodybuilding journey as a whole, but obviously also their use of steroids and growth hormone in the case of my study. So yeah, not everybody was willing to talk, and obviously generally nobody wants to sort of shout about their steroid use in bodybuilding, but obviously certainly for females that's even more of a sort of stigma in sort of admitting that or talking about that openly, because you obviously, you know, are that one step of taking a male hormone. So yeah, you know, some people were reluctant to speak, and you know, that may be because, you know, I was talking to people who were actively competing for the most part. So obviously there's that they would take into consideration, I guess. Yeah.
And I mean, I found there's a number of areas that I found particularly interesting. Which tell us about some of the results and some of your conclusions of that work. And I've got a couple more questions if you don't cover it.
Okay. Well, yeah, I suppose I was able, with all my myriad of data, to kind of like track a journey into why people, you know, coming, you know, to this decision and what their experience is of coming to bodybuilding. And I suppose in the first instance, you know, many people had different stories as to why they, you know, choose to enter the bodybuilding world and choose to compete. But I think a common theme I found that it was offering people something in terms of, you know, maybe salvation from their unruly body. They wanted to, you know, change their body and their body image. For others, it was escape from other sort of life events. And of course, once you're in, you know, that community is offering you a sort of a new identity, a whole new community, a set of friends, you know, for some people, maybe even a romantic partner. So you sort of begin to see how it becomes attractive. And obviously, once you are in that process, quite often people end up, you know, having a coach figure or a key training partner who will assist them in the process to stage. And I think then that there becomes a very much a trust issue. So it's very important. A lot of things that are always mentioned is like trusting the process. And it's understanding that people do really trust these coach figures. who are prescribing, the training, the diet, the supplementation, and ultimately quite often whatever steroid and associated drug regime that person may end up using. And I suppose it struck me that, some of my participants with hindsight sort of thought, oh yeah, well, that coach, actually they put me on completely the wrong regime, they pushed me too much, but there was always a willingness to move on to the next coach and place the same trust in the next person, and obviously like you go to the physio, I suppose you expect that's a professional person who's got your best interests at heart. You don't know anything about it necessarily, so you can understand why that trust occurs, especially if you haven't got anything to benchmark it against in a way. And then I suppose once you're in that community as well, it becomes clear to you, especially in the competing sort of scenario, that there's a sense that everybody's doing it. You need to take the drugs in order to be competitive on stage and achieve the physique that you want to achieve, especially if you're looking to do some of the sort of heavier classes, physique and above. Many people just began to realize that that's what they would need to do. And yeah, this kind of like general feeling of that it's kind of a normal part and parcel of the process. So it's just another step in the series of steps and stages you need to take to get on stage. You need to do the training, you need to do the diet, you need to take the drugs. It's a logical step. And I think under that you can then sort of start to justify that decision to yourself, and the community justifies it to itself, and therefore this acceptable use is kind of, you can exonerate it yourself and the community exonerates that use. Of course, going back to if you're a woman, that can be a fine line between where it's nice, it's controlled, acceptable use, and then, oh, hang on, you've gone a bit too far, where even attitudes within the community, and among your peers, if you want to go to the very heavier sort of muscular categories as a woman, you may be training that fine line where other people do think, well, you've taken it too far now. So again, I think as a woman, you're treading a finer line in terms of the levels of muscularity that are celebrated and acceptable.
I found it fascinating hearing you talk about that and the relationship. And you said about the sort of professional relationship you may have with a physio, but this relationship is very different. I mean, you used with salvation and community identity, relationship, trust, and that. And it was one of the points I was going to ask you about is this: it becoming almost spiritual. This relationship and it fulfilling that element of people's lives as much as the physicality.
Yeah, I think in the first instance, many people are looking for a coach, like you might look for a professional to help you with something in the first instance. But yeah, then that relationship does become, very sort of, it can be a very strong sort of relationship of trust between sort of coach and client. And so, yeah, I think once you're in that, and obviously it's up to you to sort of if you fail in the process, you fail to trust in that process. If you disagree with that and anything, really to be questioned once you're sort of in that relationship. You don't really, it's not really the done thing to, in my experience, certainly to question what a coach's strategy might be. For example, so yeah, I suppose that relationship is quite sacred in that context. Yeah.
And it must be, I mean, for someone in your position, you've got a science background, you're very well versed in the physiology and the nutrition and that side. Whereas some of the people who are excellent coaches in many ways, but won't have that background that you've got and some of those fundamentals. And it must be quite suppose for someone like yourself, it's quite a step to make to give yourself over
Yeah,
to somebody else.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's probably what I found. I where I differed from some of my participants. I think because, you know, I had I was coming into it with some background knowledge, whereas, you know, a sort of recreational gym goer may not have that. So yes, it can be I found it very difficult to engage in that full sort of trust, where I recognised that other people were able to do that a lot more easily. I think, you know, because of, yeah, I would want to ask questions. I would want to think, oh, hang on, that doesn't seem right. So some people, they did just see, you know, taking an Anavar pill as just, you know, no big deal, because they probably weren't really too aware of like what that even was in some cases. Whereas obviously, again, with what I was doing, especially, you know, once I was in the sort of PhD, you become a little bit more obviously clued up and, you know, about that decision. It becomes a bigger decision. But I think for others, it was just, you know, it's just another step, a logical step in the route to the stage. And yeah, you don't really have that sort of that benchmark or background knowledge to really compare it against. So whether it be, you know, what compounds someone is offering you, or what dietary protocol they're putting you on as well.
Because I mean, there's no way of knowing whether that Anavar is Anavar or whether it's Anabol, or and whether it's 5 milligrams or, you know, I suppose for a male physiology, it can absorb some of those things. For females, the stakes are much higher when it comes to those masculinizing effects.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that was always something in the back of my mind, like, you know, that would be something that I would be very concerned about, where I think other people were sort of, hadn't quite, or again, I suppose that kind of trust element is, oh, well, you know, often the coach was also the person who would be supplying the steroids. So that trust relationship sort of extends to, okay, well, you know, I've been told this is like legitimate. Yeah. So, you know, again, there's trust placed in that way as well.
So out of the mountains of really fascinating data that you generated, are you able to pull any of that together in relation to, say, you know, from public health point of view, from a harm reduction or a health promotion point of view? Are there anything that we can gather from it?
I think it creates a much better understanding of people's journeys, sort of, you know, through this process and how that decision is made. I suppose for myself, it also highlighted, you know, the sort of how many people had, you know, particularly sort of negative experiences, you know, with primary care, you know, specifically sort of GPs, and the ability to, or the desire to want to do GPs. Generally, the community is quite sort of closed. So, you know, you're going to these cultural members for advice. People were very reluctant to go outside of that. I think, you know, people had more positive experience with sort of needle exchange programs, but I think there was a bit of being sort of shoved alongside, you know, more recreational psychoactive drug users, when, you know, bodybuilders, you know, you view yourself as an athlete, so you see it as a means to an end, as part of a sport. So there's a little bit of a stigma of accessing those kind of clinics due to that. I think the other thing that came out that was quite interesting was, you know, even if people had like quite a strong trust in a male coach, they still like to talk to peers and other women about issues, and I think that could be, you know, as something that's a little bit more tailored towards women specifically as well, because there's obviously nothing really like that. And someone had sort of tried to do that on with an, you know, online sort of space, and you know, that might be quite a good way of, you know, women being able to sort of talk about these issues, you know, in a sort of safer space, and be able to talk a little bit more specifically about women's issues. So yeah, I suppose that kind of, you know, were some of the things that came out. I also kind of felt that, you know, this, anybody can, there's very little sort of I suppose, like, standards within, you know, becoming a coach, and I suppose, like, capturing these kind of like cultural members who people will listen to. I suppose, first of all, like, having them on board a little bit more with the harm reduction message, because people will listen to them, because, you know, they are sort of like key members of that community that, you know, have that status. So I think they would be really good advocates in sort of promoting, like, harm reduction. And I suppose going forward, you know, if somebody is, you know, seeking a bodybuilding coach, you know, how do they sort of benchmark, you know, a good coach from a bad coach? You know, unfortunately, in the community, what's most important about choosing a coach is, you know, how successful they've been in the bodybuilding world, and maybe how many competitors they've produced, not necessarily their qualification. But I think it would be nice if there was a cultural shift towards valuing that a little bit more, so people could choose a coach at least based on some sort of credentials, because, and especially, you know, now with the online world, you could do one show and then call yourself a prep coach, and with little to no knowledge, all you've done is follow someone else's advice. And you know, that's so much more easy to do nowadays as well, because of the online space.
Yeah, it'd be good to see more women coaches come through as well.
Yeah.
But there must be a real barrier to that, or it would appear to me that, you know, there seems to be. I'm not aware of any female coaches.
Yeah, I think there's not as many, but, you know, I've come across a few. Again, people who've been in the industry for quite a while, who will have, you know, that sort of status within the sort of bodybuilding world, or the gym they're at. Yeah, you're much more likely to end up with a male coach, though.
Yeah. Well, and I suppose final question would be around where would you like to take the research, or what plans you may have for the future?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'd like to sort of, you know, pursue this sort of topic a little bit further, you know, pursue the idea of, you know, garnering, like, these sort of key cultural figures in terms of that harm reduction process, and so I suppose then the research will be, you know, talking to them a little bit more, and seeing how that could happen, perhaps. I suppose as well, you know, seeing what their attitudes are towards that, and how on board they would be. I mean, I mentioned before, I did a little bit of sort of photo in my research, which I, you know, wasn't able to do an awful lot of due to time constraints. I think that methodology would be really insightful as well. So I was having people sort of take pictures of their lives as bodybuilders, and then sort of describe those to me. And I think that gave a real insight, and I was sort of, I think doing more of that would provide sort of further insight. Yeah. I think also, like, I obviously was involved with a specific type of user, you know, someone who goes to the gym, ends up with a coach. You know, there are probably other people who, you know, don't go down that route, maybe order drugs online, etc. Yeah. So are there other users who take other routes, and what's their experience, and how do they make that decision? So yeah, and I guess as well, like, obviously, you know, these days the sort of advent of, like, social media, and the presence on social media, and how that, you know, impacts on people's sort of body image, or maybe, you know, how people sort of end up, you know, being drawn to bodybuilding maybe because of consuming some of these images online. And I suppose I'm quite interested in the sort of body image aspects of it, and how not just taking the drugs, but what a damaging effect like being in such an aesthetic sport for such a prolonged period might have on your body image and you know, your relationship with food, because obviously there's quite extreme diets to be had. So I'm quite interested in that sort of aspect of it as well, because that can also have quite a long-lasting effect.
Yeah, oh, that's fantastic. I mean, the best of luck going forward. Thank you. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.